What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and it occurred to me recently that we never finished Dan Slott's run on Spider-Man. Now, for those of you guys who don't know what that means, Dan Slott had a very lengthy run on Spider-Man. It started with Big Time, which is where I usually always tell people to start whenever it is that they want to start reading Spider-Man. It goes into stuff like Spider Island and a lot of the stories that you've heard of over the years, and then it went into all new, all different Marvel, it went into Superior Spider-Man, all kinds of different things. So, here's what we're going to do with this video. We're going to take the first comic, we're going to break it off, we're going to do some retreading ground on things that we've already done because it's been so long, and then we're going to probably do the other 4 comics by themselves, right? Because Clone Conspiracy is a 5-issue series, right? 5-issue mini-series. This whole thing basically comes after Before Dead No More, and Before Dead No More was basically a story that was written by Dan Slott where, by some strange way, all these different people who had died over the life of Spider-Man, not everyone who had died, but a lot of these people who had died over the course of Peter Parker's life as Spider-Man had started popping up, and it basically turned out that it was Miles Warren, the Jackal, who was basically doing it. Now, one of the big moments that came from this came with the return of Vanessa, who was the wife of the Kingpin, who had long since been dead. Kingpin picked up right off the bat that it was not his Vanessa, and he basically killed the clone. But Miles Warren had basically been resurrecting people or cloning people and then passing them off as the originals, right? So what this does is this initially picks up with the death of J. Jameson Senior. Now, J. Jameson Senior, of course, as you imagine, is the father of J. Jonah Jameson, the guy that's always making those news scenes and hates Spider-Man. In more recent years, J. Jonah Jameson has actually become an ally of Spider-Man, which took place during Dan Slott's run. It was a huge change of pace for the character. But J. Jameson Senior had actually married Aunt May, right? So he was Peter Parker's stepdad by all standards of measurement, and a long and strong relationship had formed between the two. And it was cool, right? It was a pretty interesting change. But one of the things that goes on here is that for J. Jameson Senior, he was actually dying of natural causes. There wasn't really anything Peter Parker had done that had led to him dying. He hadn't sustained any kind of mortal injuries, and it was collateral damage in a fight between like Peter Parker and Dr. Octopus. It was basically just old age. And for Peter Parker, it still hits him just the same. And the reason why is because for the second time in his life, he's standing next to his Aunt May, helping her grieve over the loss of a husband. Once was bad enough. And again, the death of Uncle Ben was probably the single most important death in the history of the Spider-Man mythos, because it taught him the price to be paid for doing nothing when you could do something. And so having to sit next to Aunt May and relive this entire experience is kind of crushing for Peter. Now, I don't mean to say this is all about him, right? Peter's a narcissist. I don't really mean to say that. It's a crushing experience to have to endure that, because this was yet another instance when Peter could have done something that would have saved the life of J. Jameson Senior. And of course, this leads to his son, J. Jonah, freaking out on Peter Parker and losing it on him. And the reason why is because he says, like, you were the one who talked my father and your Aunt May out of the treatments that could have saved his life. Like, it's because of you that he's dead. He could have lived had he undergone those treatments. Now, all this really begins to kind of get fleshed out, and it's explained to us by way of a character named Anna Maria Marconi. Now, for people who are familiar with our coverage of the Spider-Man run by Dan Slott, or those of you guys who have read it, you guys know who Anna Marconi is. For those of you guys who don't know, Anna Maria Marconi knows Peter Parker is Spider-Man. And the reason for this all goes back to Superior Spider-Man, right? So Superior Spider-Man was basically a story Dan Slott wrote where you ended up learning over the course of a pretty lengthy period of time that, one, Dr. Octopus's body was breaking down due to all the experiments he'd done on himself and just the overall toll that his actions had taken on his physical form. And so what he intended to do was continue his survival by, in effect, taking his consciousness and putting it in the body of Peter Parker. And that's where you get Superior Spider-Man. Now, during that time, it was really kind of a redemption story for Doc Ock, because up to that point, he had a few different moments here and there where he had like saved the life of Peter Parker or something like that, or it helped Peter Parker with some kind of science or something along those lines. But by and large, he was always still a villain in general. What Superior Spider-Man did is it changed a few things. One, it really introduced to us the idea that Peter Parker had been pulling his punches all those times. Like literally, there's one point where Dr. Octopus faces off against the Scorpion and punches his jaw off of his face and realizes, holy cow, Peter Parker's been like holding, like he's been pulling his punches all the time. He could have killed us at any point in time. It's amazing that he didn't. The other part of it is that because Dr. Octopus or Superior Spider-Man came across Anna Marconi, she was the one that actually kind of helped him to redeem himself, right? To help him realize there's more to life than just like robbing banks or trying to kill Spider-Man or something along those lines. And so because of Anna Marconi's moral influence on Dr. Octopus, he actually started becoming a superhero. And so one of the things that he did is he expanded the technology that Peter Parker used, as minor as it was, to help to really make him a more effective Spider-Man. Now, it was really done for Doc Ock himself as Superior Spider-Man, because his thought was, I can't be everywhere at once, but I can develop little spider bots that can be everywhere at once and alert me of anything that's going on. And if it doesn't require my attention, I can notify the cops. The other thing that happened here is he basically started developing Parker Industries. And Parker Industries was kind of a think tank, a continuation of what was called Horizon Labs, which was the think tank that Peter Parker was originally part of, just a great big huge collection of geniuses. And then as Superior Spider-Man, Dr. Octopus developed Parker Industries to be a kind of expansive, almost worldwide organization that could basically better humanity, right? It was just a huge change of pace. The big thing about this is that Anna Marconi, if I remember correctly, didn't know that Dr. Octopus was in the body of Peter Parker. She just thought it was Peter Parker, right? She didn't really know the difference. Ultimately, when Peter got his body back, there was a huge amount of confusion going on with Anna Marconi because of how he was acting, because she was asking him about things that Peter Parker didn't have any recollection of, because it was Dr. Octopus controlling his body instead of Peter. And so ultimately, Peter had to come clean, and he had to tell her, okay, look, here's everything that went on. That guy was not actually me. It was a guy who was in control of my body. I'm Peter Parker. Yes, I'm Spider-Man, yada, yada, yada. And that's how she ended up finding out his identity, right? So it was a really, really good story. But the reason why Peter here is focusing on the fact that he could have saved Jameson Senior is because there came a point during his illness when Jameson Senior was approached by a company called New You Technologies. Now, the idea behind this was that at a previous point in time, there was a great big huge explosion, right? That, you know, this great big huge thing that took place out in Oklahoma, and that one of the workers, well, really it was at a Parker Industries plant, but one of the workers named Jerry Salteris was injured. And so New You Technologies approached him and his family with the possibility of basically giving him the kind of transplants and things he needed in order to survive, which they went with. The problem was, as soon as the experiment was done and Peter met with Jerry Salteris, because he was a member of Parker Industries, right, an employee of the company, Peter went to go shake his hand and his spider sense went crazy. Peter didn't know what it meant. He had no idea what it meant. He just knew that something was wrong. And based on that flimsy piece of evidence at that moment in time, he used that as a reason to talk Jameson Senior and Aunt May out of New You Technologies, just because of the fact that it was in effect his own hunch, right? It was his gut telling him something was wrong. And that's kind of a big thing to go on, right? Especially with somebody like Peter. Now, granted, there is a measure of acceptance there that Peter kind of looks at that and says, okay, my spider sense has never done me wrong. So even if I don't know exactly what's wrong, I know something is wrong. This Jerry Salteris guy is not the guy I know. There's something going on here with this guy. And basically by kind of extrapolating that out, he could look at it and say, if Jameson goes through this whole procedure, I don't know what's going to happen to him afterwards. He'll probably recover, but then something's going to be wrong. Something bad is going to happen. I just don't know what it is. And so we ultimately talked them out of it. Now, the biggest issue that Peter has here, and this is really where he screwed up, he didn't really tell them why. He didn't really give them all the information that they needed to make an informed decision. It was just, Aunt May, Jameson Senior, you can't do this procedure because we don't really know a whole lot about their science. You have to just trust me on this. And in reality, asking somebody to put their life on the line and really just kind of going on the idea that they assume that you're giving them all the information, that's pretty shady, right? It's kind of a shady thing for Peter Parker to do. And that's why a lot of this guilt is weighing on his head, because he just didn't do everything he was supposed to. And so at this point, he's like, okay, let's kind of go back to New You and let's investigate this a little bit more. So what he ends up doing is going back to Edmond, Oklahoma and visiting with Jerry Salteris' wife. The problem is Jerry's not there, right? Jerry is just kind of vanished. And when the question's why, like, you know, what's going on here, then basically his wife ends up showing him a kind of a video clip. And essentially it's just one of these things where he's talking about how he's setting up a camp and all that kind of good stuff. And then he has what are in effect these kind of illness moments, right? These moments where he experiences a lot of pain and he's like, it'll pass, it'll be fine, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And when the question's asked of Peter, what's going on here, Peter says it's cellular degradation, right? His cells are basically breaking down. And he's like, I think I know what's going on here. And so at that point, he basically makes a promise that he can't keep. And that's one of the cool things about the way that Dan Slott handles Spider-Man, right? When it comes to Peter Parker, what made him so popular over the years in Marvel Comics was the relatability factor, right? The fact that he's just like a young kid who's down on his luck, right? The Parker luck, the fact that he can never really seem to catch a break, seemingly everything that can go wrong does go wrong. The reality is when it comes to Peter, the emotional, empathetic side of him always seemed to kind of get the better of him. And he would always kind of find himself in these predicaments where he would essentially make promises that he couldn't keep. And that's one of the things that he does here, right? He tells this woman, you know, he tells Jerry Salteris' wife, we'll get your husband back and everything is going to be okay. But he can't make that promise because he's not holding all the cards. He doesn't know everything that's going on here. And even Anna calls it on that. She's like, look, man, like I understand where you're coming from. I understand you want to do the good thing. You want to be the good CEO who runs this company and cares about his people, and that's fine. fine, but you can't make promises that you cannot keep, right? You don't know everything that's going on here. But one of the things that Peter kind of has is an ace up his sleeve. Or what he had done is when his spider sense initially went off after meeting Jerry Saltaris, he hit him with a spider tracker, right? Which is actually one of the pieces of technology that Dr. Octopus had developed when he was Superior Spider-Man. But he hits him with a spider tracker and then uses that to track his location. And while Anna Marconi and the other members of Horizon are basically working on understanding the medicine that Jerry was taking, breaking it down on the cellular level and understanding what it's actually made of, Peter is breaking into New U to basically find Jerry. The problem is that once he gets in here, he realizes this is all just like a giant lab, right? He literally gets to like one of these tanks and it looks like the eyes move for a second, but the tracking device leads him to this location. The problem is it's all just nervous system, right? It's literally just a body of nerves. There's no muscle, there's no sinew, no bone, no none of that stuff except for eyeballs. And the eyeballs actually look like they move for a second, which in all reality, if a person was stuck in this condition, they'd have to be experiencing pain beyond imagining, right? It would have either that or the nerves are basically are muted. The pain in the nerves is muted and he just doesn't feel anything. The problem is that as he's investigating, then suddenly it's like this guy walks in and Peter's like, what in the heck? And he's like, oh my God, it's Miles Warren. And as soon as Peter realizes it's Miles Warren, he's like, it's a clone thing. Now, here's the reason why Peter realizes that. Back in the 1990s, Marvel had this genius idea that actually turned out to be a 3-year-long unmitigated disaster that was called the Clone Saga. And you talk to anybody who knows anything about Spider-Man, and they will tell you that story was bad and Marvel should feel bad. The idea behind it was fantastic, that Miles Warren basically created clones of Peter Parker as a means to kind of eliminate Peter, replace him with somebody else. And for us as the reader, and even for Peter himself, he didn't know if he was the clone. He didn't know if Ben Reilly was the actual Spider-Man or if Kane was the actual Spider-Man. There was no real way to know. The problem is it ballooned up from what should have just been like a 6-issue story into a 3-year-long, over 100-issue story arc that was 90% unnecessary and full of nonsense. But where Miles Warren exists, a clone problem has to exist somewhere near it, right? That's always been the Jackal's thing ever since the events of the original Clone Saga. And so because of that, Peter's like, okay, this is obviously some kind of clone thing, right? Like he's like, oh, I'm gonna tear your heart out, right? Like Peter gets wildly frustrated, and not necessarily because of the fact that the Jackal might be cloning Peter. That's not part of it. It's because when the Jackal gets involved in stuff like this, he doesn't care who he hurts. It doesn't matter who he involves here, right? It's just as long as he can do whatever it is that he needs to do, right? It's messing with people's lives, which is a far more extreme action than like robbing a bank or something like that. As far as Peter's concerned, based on his moral compass, tearing a family apart is way worse than stealing $1 million from a bank that's insured and will basically be given back, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it sucks that they did it, but it's really more the crime, the action they committed, they're arrested for, not because people feel bad for the banks, right? That's not really what's going on. Now, of course, Miles Warren calls in security, and then you're basically met by the Rhino and the new Electro. So as part of this whole lead up to Before Dead No More, one of the things that had happened is that a former girlfriend had actually been brought back by New U Technologies, who was basically somebody Max Dillon had actually killed by accident. Now, when she was brought back, she had actually kissed Electro and basically siphoned off all of his electrical power and killed him in the process, and basically absorbed his abilities. So she became the new Electro. It was kind of cool. It was pretty interesting. Marvel never did anything with it that mattered, but it was kind of interesting. But of course, it's one of those things where Peter's like, wait a minute, so you're a new Electro? And she's like, yeah. And he's like, and Rhino's kind of an idiot. So it's like, all right, I know how to solve this problem. So while Peter's ducking and dodging, he ends up basically going behind or going to a wall that of course, was a barrier between an enormous amount of water and the facility itself, rips it open, like ends up basically, dumping the water supply into this place. And of course, water's a perfect current for electricity, ends up taking out Electro and Rhino. Now, it's one of the funny things here because if this was Max Dillon, he would have been like, nope, and he would have dodged out of the way because he would have seen it coming. But it's one of the things that Peter says is like, that's the great thing about the new Electro. You have no idea about any of the old tricks, and Rhino wasn't going to stop me because he's a moron. So it's it's one of those funny things because from there, with them out of the way, Peter basically starts making his way through the New Use facility, trying to find Miles Warren, only to be met with Gwen Stacy. And this blew my mind when this happened, because my initial thought was, okay, so this is obviously a clone, right? It's obviously a clone that's going on here, but here's the kicker. Whenever Peter comes across these clones, it sets his spider sense off. With Gwen Stacy, it doesn't. And so what it looks like is that it is actually Gwen Stacy. That's the thought, right? It is really Gwen Stacy, which is a huge deal. Why? Because Gwen Stacy was the first real girlfriend that Peter Parker had. Technically, there was Betty Brant, but they were more knocking boots, right? Friends with benefits, if you really want to call it that. Gwen Stacy was the first real love of Peter Parker, right? Like in love, head over heels, his and hers towels, sharing stuff, you know, sharing the bathroom, right? She's bringing her toothbrush and toothpaste over and a few changes of clothes, right? Like we're in it now. Like that was Gwen Stacy, right? That was Gwen Stacy for Peter Parker. The crazy thing about this is Gwen Stacy died, right? 1971, written by Jerry Conway, the night Gwen Stacy died. That was a story that changed Peter Parker entirely, right? Because one of the things, the idea of Uncle Ben dying was significant because it taught Peter, with great power must come great responsibility, right? The lessons of his Uncle Ben rang true. With the death of Gwen Stacy, it taught Peter Parker he can't be reckless. That was so important. That was a wildly important thing because depending on who you talk to, and even the comic itself is a little murky, right? Like Gwen Stacy falls off the bridge, Peter Parker shoots his webbing into her foot. You hear this, like literally it just says like crack. So the indication is that Peter Parker broke her neck by shooting his webbing into her foot. This just like the jerk snapped her neck. But then the Green Goblin's like, she was already dead before you got here. So it's kind of murky, right? You don't really know if Peter Parker was the one who got Gwen Stacy killed or if the Green Goblin had already killed her. But regardless of the situation, the death of Gwen Stacy taught Peter Parker you cannot be reckless with your powers. And so that was huge because following that, of course, Mary Jane Watson came into the mix and the two of them ended up forming a relationship. But the idea of Gwen Stacy being here is nuts because it totally takes Peter Parker by surprise. And that matters because immediately his spider sense goes off. And he's like, okay, my spider sense is not related to her because if it was, it would have already been going off. The problem is he doesn't catch it. Why? Because he's clunked over the head with the tentacles of Dr. Octopus, who has officially returned to Marvel Comics. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. And I will catch you all in the next video. Peace.